I could share the Nasruddin story if you want. This is Nasruddin. Well, I'll have Nasruddin introduce himself. So he's outside. It's a gas street light. This is before they had electricity, and he's out under the street light looking around. And his neighbor comes on the ground, and his neighbor comes and says, "Nasruddin, what are you looking for?" And he says, "I'm looking for the key to my house." And then the neighbor, trying to help, says, "Well, where did you lose it?" And he said, "I lost it in my house." And the neighbor said, "Well, why aren't you looking for it in your house?" And Nasruddin says, "Because it's dark in there." And so there are many ways of interpreting this, but here we are as human beings. The vast majority of human beings spend their whole lives under the streetlight looking for something that is in their house the whole time. And it appears to be a satisfying thing because there's all kinds of cool things under the streetlight, but inside, happiness comes from inside, as people find out after sooner or later. All right, okay. There are some phenomenal human beings on this planet, and of course, Sufis don't have a monopoly in this by any matter of means. But little did I know that by wanting to hang out with the Sufis, that I was going to be, largely, with a group of amazing human beings who've been cultivating, trying to be complete human beings, for most of their lives. Well, a complete human being, sometimes this word, kamel, is translated as perfect. But my feeling is that perfection is not a part of being human. Our imperfection makes us perfect, okay? And so you might say being a complete human being is seeing and experiencing the hugely layered, larger contexts that are in our human experience that we usually ignore or not even aware of. So what does that mean? On one level, sometimes Sufis, I said mystics, remember? Well, 90% of Sufi activity has nothing to do with mysticism or contemplative practice. It has to do with healing people. So if you go to an Islamic country and you go to a Sufi shrine, most of the people who are there for healing. Either physical healing, spiritual healing, it doesn't really make any difference. They're there for healing. And so in many ways, the Sufis took over what the yogis and the shamans used to do, okay? They Islamicized these things, okay? Just like the Tibetan Buddhists, did in the Bon tradition or the Zen tradition with the Shinto. I mean, this is, And so these healings are something that try to help people become more in harmony, because basically, why do we need healing? We need healing because we're out of harmony. So a complete human being is in harmony, not only with the physical world, but in harmony with the other realms. There is a natural proclivity for people to be occupied with things in the outer world and to ignore themselves. I mean, so for example, we all have the experience of it's so much easier to see the faults in other people, for example, and the hardest thing is to see the log in our eye rather than the splinter in someone else's eye. So that's one of the things, okay, that there's a natural proclivity not to be looking at oneself and And the other thing is that our system of education is set up purposely, well, I don't know, purposely a bit, but it's set up for us to be dealing in the outside world and to taking control of the outside world. And we've, in Western society, you know, the technological cornucopia of that is phenomenal. But also we're ruining the environment. I mean, you know, we're poisoning our own, you know, our own house, okay? And, you know, there's still a lot of difficulties that seem to, you know, not have been addressed. And so the whole educational system, the whole society is geared toward, you know, outer things. Now, why we do know that these contemplative practices exist. I mean, and actually for the first time in human history, you know, English readers can read, you know, the mystical texts, you know, from all the traditions. And so you would think that this would be, you know, an amazing, you know, there'd be amazing efforts on the part of people to be involved with this. And and I say that, you know, I mean, for me it's so obvious, but what I say to my students, because this is not so obvious to the majority of people, or otherwise they'd be doing contemplative practice. You know, I say, think of yourself 10 years ago. Would you want to be that person? I don't know anyone who would, all right? Okay, maybe there are some people, but they, you know. And the reason why we don't want to be that person is because we have, in some degree, in most cases, not very much, but we have, you know, we have learned things, and our level of consciousness is different than it was 10 years ago. We live in a larger context than we did 10 years ago. I mean, if we don't, there's something wrong. Okay, okay, so okay, there's definitely that's a sign of, you know, yeah, find a Sufi or something. Anyway, but so here we have the technologies that have been developed for thousands of years, whether it's Sufism or Tibetan Buddhism or you name it. All right, Taoism, and these are technologies where we can consciously evolve, consciously be comfortable in our house. And many of these traditions mention the heart. And, you know, home is where the heart is. So I don't get it. You know, I don't get it why people, you know, have all these things available and yet they're not interested. Okay. Now, there's a political dimension, which is a very important one, which is that the powers that be, in the past, it was religious organizations. It was no coincidence that the church and the governmental powers in where Buddhists were, it was no coincidence they put these people in monasteries. Okay, because when people start to evolve, they start to question the dogmas. And now in the West, we're living in a set of scientific material. The new religion is scientific materialism, except that no one realizes it. All right, you know, they think they're atheists, but their God, you know, their gods, or you know, are this all there. All right, okay, and that's part of the control mechanism is to have people aren't even aware that they're a member of this religion. All right, and so if things were start to shift, then the system would, you know, would be threatened. Okay, and there's a lot of vested interest. I mean, why are psychedelics? I'm not promoting any kind of illegal substance use, but why are psychedelics banned? And the most dumbing down drug you can think of, alcohol, is legal. Just think about this. The scientific community, a large part of it has moved from an open inquiry to a relatively closed inquiry. William James had a very well-known psychologist in the early part of the 20th century, said that we should be approaching psychic, psychological, and spiritual phenomena in the same way that we approach physical phenomena. In other words, they should be investigated and be brought in as part of the phenomena that scientists investigate. And he called this radical empiricism. But unfortunately, the field of psychology went toward B.F. Skinner, all right, which is narrowed down to a very reductionist way of approaching phenomena. But the question is, how is it that this dogma, one of the characteristics of scientific materialism is that there's a certain dogma of what is allowed and what's not allowed. So one of the things that's not allowed is to investigate phenomena that science can't explain. So a scientist, and I was in chemical engineering, I was trained as a scientist. A scientist is someone who has a sense of wonder and who asks questions. And so instead of having that sense of wonder and say, we can't explain this, let's investigate it, all right? Instead, the scientific materialist response is, we can't explain this, so let's pretend it doesn't exist. And anyone who wants to investigate it, we're going to come down on them as being charlatans or whatever the words that they use. Now, in the last week, I've been wondering about this. How did this scientific materialism, how did this come about? Now, I don't know if anyone's investigated this, okay? But this is this is a very tentative way that I'm considering looking at it, which is that in the West, things are very different of how we construct things versus how things are constructed, let's say in the Far East, China, Japan. Let me give you an example with religion, okay? If I were to say to you, I'm a Christian Muslim, or I'm a Jewish Christian. Actually, there are some of those, but they're not really Jewish Christian. Or I'm a Jewish Muslim. Actually, there's some of those too. But these are things that normally, people would say that can't be. Because there's this what I would call a monotheistic consciousness in the West. Now, in Japan, in China, you can be a Christian, when you get born and have baptism. You can be a Shinto when you get married and go through a Shinto ceremony. And the Buddhists have very nice death transition ceremonies. And it's totally logical in the Japanese mind. Actually, it's totally logical in my mind too, that you could be all three and there's not a problem, okay? And the Chinese, I don't know if I've heard this or I've read this, but it's like, let's hedge since we really don't know what's going to happen after we die, we'll just be all those religions and then we're hedging our bets, okay? Now that's very logical, but not in the West. It's got to be one. You can't be a Jew in anything else. You can't be a Christian in anything else, and you can't be a Muslim in anything else. And so I wonder whether this mentality has now, evidenced itself in scientific materialism. Why can't we have two paradigms in physics? One for quantum physics. Well, actually we do, all right? But why are we trying to why are we trying to say that there has to be one? Okay, I mean, maybe there is one, but why don't we have multiple paradigms? In math, you have different forms of math depending on the assumptions. Why can't we have that in all the sciences? Anyway, so that's my latest thinking on this.